The gate banged open. Patrick heard it from inside, a hard, flat sound, not wind, not an accident. Someone pushing through with purpose. He was already half-dressed, shirt untucked, one boot on, the other in his hand. He'd been up since 4 doing paperwork that wouldn't do itself. He set the boot down and went to the window first, out of habit. 3 figures in the yard, one short, one tall, and one that moved between them like she belonged to neither. The short one was a child, already crouched by the fence post, poking at the latch with one finger. The tall one stood straight, arms folded across her chest, not looking at anything in particular. And between them, led by a rope that the tall one held without looking at it, a horse. It favored its front left leg. Not dramatically, not falling, just a small, careful shift of weight with each step. The kind of hesitation that meant it had been hurting for a while and had learned to manage. Patrick put his boot on and went outside. The morning was cool. The step beyond the fence was pale green and moving, the grass bending in a wind that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to do. He squinted at the horse first. Bay, about 12 years old, maybe 14. Well-kept coat, clean hooves. Someone cared about this animal. The left foreleg showed a slight swelling above the fetlock, the skin tight, the hair matted where something had been pressed against it. He walked closer without greeting anyone. "Let him stand," he said. The tall one released the rope. The horse stood, and Patrick crouched beside the leg, his fingers moving slowly, reading the joint the way he'd been reading joints for 11 years. The swelling was warm, not infected, not yet. The horse let him touch it without flinching too much, which told him either the pain was deep and slow, or the animal trusted humans more than its condition suggested it should. He stood up, looked at the horse's eyes. Calm. Tired, but calm. Behind him, the short orc had stopped poking the fence post and was now standing 2 feet from his elbow, watching him with eyes the color of old amber. She came up to his hip. She was covered in something, a smear of something brown on her cheek, a grass stain on her knee. The rubber boots she wore were 2 different shades of green, which he suspected was not intentional. "Does it hurt him a lot?" she asked. Her voice was matter-of-fact, no whine in it, the question of someone who wanted actual information. "Some," Patrick said. "He's been walking on it." "He always does that," she said. "He doesn't like to show it." He looked at her. She looked back. He didn't comment on that. The third figure, the one who was not the child and not the tall one with the rope, stepped forward. She was shorter than the tall one by half a head, broader, wearing a dress with flowers on it that made no logical sense for an early morning on the edge of the step. She had a basket on her arm. She smiled before she'd even reached him. "Good morning. I'm Rami. This is Emma, and that's Chica. The horse is Emma's. His name is Carrick, and he's been limping since the day before yesterday. But she didn't want to come until I said she had to, because you can't just sit with a sick horse, you know." She said this without pausing, one continuous current of words, then looked at him expectantly. Patrick looked at the tall one. Emma. She hadn't moved. Her arms were still folded, her amber eyes fixed on a point somewhere past his left shoulder. She was dark green, the kind of green that went cool in shade and warm in light. And her hair was braided into dozens of small pigtails, some pinned up, some hanging free. A wooden horse hung on a cord around her neck, small enough to fit in a child's palm. She was a few inches taller than him, and she held herself like she knew it and had decided not to do anything about it one way or the other. She hadn't spoken yet. She didn't look like she was planning to. "How long has he been favoring it?" Patrick asked. 3 days, Emma said, 1 word per fact. He nodded. He went back to the horse and ran his hand along the leg from the knee down, slow and even pressure, watching where the animal's skin twitched. The horse exhaled through its nose, a low sound, not distress. Chica had moved again. She was now beside his instrument bag, which he'd brought out without thinking, and she was looking at the metal probe, clipped to the outside, like it was a religious artifact. "Don't touch that," he said, without heat. She didn't touch it, but she kept looking. Patrick stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at the leg once more. The swelling was a periosteal bruise, probably from a knock against something, fence post, stone, another horse's hoof. It hadn't spread into the joint. That was the important part. With rest and correct dressing, it would come down in 4 or 5 days, without leaving anything behind. "He'll be all right," Patrick said. "But I need him here a few days. He can't walk on it. If you move him now, you'll drive the bruise deeper." Rami said something like, "There, see?" under her breath, not to anyone specifically. Emma said nothing. She was looking at the horse now. Her jaw was tight. Her hands, where they gripped her own arms, had the knuckles visible beneath the skin. She'd carried this, the knowing something was wrong and the not knowing what to do, for 3 days. He recognized that kind of silence. He'd lived in a version of it for 2 years. "Corral's open," Patrick said. "Bring him in." He turned and walked back toward the clinic without waiting to see if she would. She did. Some things don't need words to settle into place. They just land, quiet as a stone in still water, and the surface closes over them. Emma said it before he asked. Patrick was washing his hands at the stone basin in the corner of the treatment room, his back to her, when she said, "I don't have the money right now." No lead-up, no softening. The sentence came out the way she probably said most things, flat, clear, aimed at the center of the thing. He turned off the tap, dried his hands on the cloth that hung from a nail. He didn't turn around immediately. He'd heard this sentence before, in many different versions, from many different people. Usually it came wrapped in apology, heads down, voices going thin. Hers didn't. She wasn't apologizing for the fact, she was reporting it. He turned around. She stood in the doorway of the treatment room, Chica pressed against her side, small fingers hooked into the waistband of her fitted trousers. Emma's arms weren't folded now. Her hands hung at her sides, which somehow looked harder than the crossed arms had. The 3 leather bracelets on her left wrist caught the morning light coming in through the window behind him. "Later," Patrick said. She looked at him. "When?" "When there is." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Ima stood in it, and he could see her working through what he'd just said. Not the words, which were simple enough, but the shape of them, the logic behind them. He watched her look for the catch, the condition attached somewhere in the fine print, the thing she'd owe that wasn't money. There wasn't one. He didn't know how to explain that without making it worse. Rami, who had stationed herself beside the door with her basket, looked between them with the expression of someone watching a game she understood but wasn't playing. She had the good sense not to speak. Chica had no such restraint. She'd moved away from her mother's side and was now standing in front of the shelf where Patrick kept his clean equipment, metal tools laid out on a cotton cloth, sorted by size. She studied them without touching. The discipline was visible, costing her something. "Which one do you use for the leg?" she asked. "The probe. Silver one, second from the left." She leaned in. "Does it hurt them?" "Depends on how you use it." "What if you use it wrong?" "Then, yes." She considered this with full seriousness. "Have you ever used it wrong?" He thought about that honestly. At the beginning, not for a long time. Ima was still watching him. He could feel it even when he was looking at Chica. The amber eyes tracking him the way you track something you haven't categorized yet. something that doesn't fit the box you've already built. 3 horses, she said abruptly. He looked at her. I keep 3 horses. It's what I do. If Carrick is here, I'm down a third. I can't. She stopped, started again. I'm telling you because you should know, not because I want you to change anything. He understood what she was actually saying. She wasn't asking him to reconsider the terms. She was explaining why the money wasn't there, so he'd understand it wasn't an excuse. It was arithmetic. 3 horses, 1 job, a 7-year-old child, and something that had fallen apart at some point. He didn't know what, and it wasn't his to ask. Carrick will be back in 5 days, he said. 6 at most. She nodded once, a soldier's nod, acknowledgement without gratitude, because gratitude wasn't what this was. He moved toward the door, and she stepped back to let him through, that automatic spatial awareness of someone who'd spent years navigating spaces built for people 2/3 her size. She did it without thinking. He noticed, and then made himself stop noticing, because that was none of his business either. In the courtyard, the horse had been put in the corral and was standing at the water trough. Rami had already found her way to the fence and was talking to Carrick in the conversational, unhurried tone that some people use with animals, because it's the only place they can talk without anyone wanting something back. The horse had his nose near her shoulder, not eating, just present. Chica ran past both of them and climbed the fence rail in 2 steps, rubber boots finding the gaps like she'd done it on 100 fences before. She sat on the top rail and looked down at the horse with both hands on her knees, proprietary and calm. He looks okay, she announced. He's tired, Patrick said. He's always tired in the morning. She said it with the certainty of a person who knows an animal well enough to tell its moods from across a yard. Patrick looked at her and thought that 7 years was enough time to learn one horse completely, if you paid attention, which she clearly did. Emma had come to stand at the fence without touching it. She looked at Carrick with something that didn't have a simple name. Not worry, exactly. Not relief. Something between the two that lives in the chest and doesn't dissolve quickly. Patrick leaned on the opposite fence post. The step beyond the corral ran flat and green to the horizon, the wind pulling the grass in long, slow waves. He'd stood in this spot 1,000 times. He didn't usually think about it. I'll check the leg twice a day, he said, morning and evening. You don't need to be here, but you can if you want. Emma looked at him sideways. Why would I not be here? It wasn't a hostile question. It was a genuine one. She didn't understand why he'd offered the option. In her arithmetic, the horse was here. Therefore, she would be here. That was not up for discussion. All right, he said. Rami laughed at something, probably nothing, probably something Carrick had done with his ears, and the sound came across the yard loose and warm, the way her sounds always seemed to, already at home in a place she'd been for less than an hour. Patrick pushed off the fence post and went back inside. He had 3 other animals to check before noon, a supply delivery at 2, and paperwork that had been waiting 3 days and would wait 3 more. He filled a bowl of feed and left it on the counter. He put the kettle on. He stood in his kitchen for a moment, looking at the 2 cups on the shelf, and then took one down and made himself tea. 1 cup, the same as every morning. The kettle didn't know anything had changed. But something had. He just couldn't say what. She came at dawn. Patrick heard the gate the first morning before he was fully awake. A careful sound this time, not the hard bang of the first day. Someone who knew where the latch stuck and worked around it. He lay still for a moment, listening, then got up. By the time he reached the window, she was already up the corral fence, her hands wrapped around the top rail, looking at Carrick. She'd braided her hair differently. Some of the pigtails were pinned tighter, out of the way. She was wearing the same boots. He put the kettle on and went out to check the leg. They worked in silence. He crouched beside the horse, unwrapped the dressing, examined the swelling, down slightly, the heat less angry than the day before. He applied the poultice, rewrapped with clean cloth, pressed the edges flat. Emma stood at the horse's head and held the halter without being asked. Her hands kept Carrick steady with the economy of someone who had done this so many times it had stopped being a conscious act. The horse didn't move. When Patrick stood, she had already stepped back. He noted the swelling in his mental log. She walked home without speaking. The steppe was orange at the edges and pale gray above, and the wind was already moving. The second morning was the same. Same time, same silence, same hands on the halter. Rami did not come. It was just the two of them and the horse and the early light. And Patrick found that he'd stopped expecting conversation and had started simply working beside her the way he worked beside the animals, without narration, without noise. On the third morning, Chica came. She arrived ahead of her mother, running, boots slapping the dirt path, and she was through the gate and at the corral before Patrick had finished his first cup of tea. He came out to find her already talking to Carrick through the fence rails, informing him in a serious voice about something that had apparently happened with a goat at Rami's place the previous afternoon. The horse listened with his ears forward. Emma came through the gate 2 minutes later at her own pace and looked at her daughter with the expression of someone who had accepted a long time ago that this particular force of nature was not directable. Patrick set his cup on the fence post and went to work on the leg. Chica migrated toward him immediately, a slow drift that covered half the distance before Emma said her name once, flat, and she stopped, but only physically. Her eyes stayed on Patrick's hands, on the instruments laid out beside him, on the roll of clean cloth. "Why do you wrap it like that?" she asked. "Not straight, but diagonal?" He showed her without stopping. "Straight puts pressure on one point. Diagonal spreads it." She looked at the wrap, looked at his hands. "Can I try on something that's not a horse?" "What did you have in mind?" She held out her own arm, wrist up, completely serious. He cut a short length of cloth and wrapped her forearm the way he'd wrapped the leg. Not tight, not loose, diagonal. She studied it while he worked, turning her arm slightly to see all sides. When he was done, she pressed it with one finger and looked satisfied. "It feels even," she said. "That's the point." She kept the wrap on for the rest of the morning. He noticed her showing it to Carrick at one point, holding her arm up to the horse's nose as evidence of something. Emma watched this without comment. She'd moved to the fence and was checking the rail for loose nails, pressing each one with her thumb. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she'd found something that needed doing, and her hands didn't like being still. She pulled a short nail from her belt pouch and tapped it back into place with a stone she picked up from the ground. Clean, efficient, no ceremony. Patrick hadn't asked her to do that, either. "Does it hurt them?" Chica asked. She was back at his elbow, the wrapped arm pressed to her chest now. "The injection." For a second. "Do they know it's going to help?" He considered that. "No, they just know it hurts." She thought about this with her whole face, brow down, mouth to one side. "That seems unfair." "It is," he said. "They trust you anyway." She looked at Carrick. The horse had turned his head toward them both, ears shifting, following the sound of voices the way horses sometimes did when they couldn't determine the significance of what was being said. She reached through the rail and put her small hand flat on his nose. He didn't pull back. "He trusts you already," she told Patrick. Behind them, Emma had moved on from the fence rail and was now at the gate checking the hinge. Patrick heard the soft, metallic complaint of it, the small adjustments she made, the way the swing changed after, smoother, no drag. She said nothing about it. She simply moved to the next thing. He watched her for a moment without watching her. The way you learn to look at something sidelong when looking directly would mean something neither of you is ready for. She had good hands. He'd noticed that the first morning. Long-fingered for an orc, precise in the way they moved, not delicate, nothing close to delicate, but exact. The kind of hands that knew how much force was enough and never used more. He didn't say any of this. He packed his instruments, rolled the cloth, and picked up his cup from the fence post. "Legs better," he said to no one specifically. "Another 3 days, maybe 2 if he keeps off it."
"He will," Chica said firmly. "I'll tell him."
Emma had come back to the corral. She looked at the horse for a moment. That same unnamed thing in her face, the one that lived between worry and relief. And then she looked at Patrick's hands where he was latching the instrument bag, and something in the set of her jaw shifted. Not much, a degree or 2. She didn't say anything. But she stopped leaving immediately. She stood by the fence for another few minutes, and Patrick went inside and washed his hands, and did not look out the window to see when she left. Some silences aren't empty. Some of them are just waiting for someone to figure out what they're for. Rami arrived at 10 in the morning with her basket and no particular reason. Patrick was in the annex, restocking the supply shelf when he heard her come through the gate. She had a way of arriving that announced itself, not loudly, but completely, the way warm air announces itself when you open a door. He came out to find her already at the corral fence, basket on her arm, speaking to Carrick in the same unhurried stream she'd used the first morning. The horse had come to the fence. He had not come to the fence for Patrick that morning, which Patrick noted without offense. Emma was already there. She'd come at dawn as usual, checked the horse, stayed. She was sitting on the upturned crate near the water trough, elbows on her knees, watching Carrick move along the fence line. The swelling was down enough that he walked with less hesitation now, testing the leg in small increments, the way animals did when they were deciding whether to trust their own body again. Rami looked at Emma. Emma looked at Rami with the expression of someone who had already accepted that this was simply what Rami did, arrived, filled the space, could not be redirected. "I came to check on things," Rami said. "You came to look around," Emma said. "Both can be true." Rami smiled. She had dimples that appeared and disappeared quickly, punctuation rather than decoration. She set her basket on the fence post and looked at the clinic, the courtyard, the annex, taking inventory in the cheerful, systematic way of someone who knew everyone's business and considered this a form of care. "He keeps it clean," she said, meaning the clinic. "Some of them don't." Emma said nothing. Patrick came out with a cloth over his shoulder and stopped when he saw both of them. He'd known Rami was there. He hadn't known Emma was still here. "Mornin'," Rami said. "I'm not in the way." "You're fine," he said, because she was, and because saying otherwise would not have changed anything. He went to the corral and opened the gate and walked to Carrick slowly, giving the horse time to track him, decide about him, settle. He ran his hand along the neck first, the shoulder, then crouched beside the leg. The swelling had reduced to a firm line along the bone rather than a spread. The heat was nearly gone. Another 2 days, he thought. Maybe 1. He was aware of Emma watching him. He'd been aware of it every morning, but something about this morning was different, because Rami was there as well, and the two of them made a different kind of silence than one person alone. Rami was quiet for almost a full minute, which for her was an effort. She used it to watch Patrick work. Then she started talking again, about the chickens, about a fence post that needed replacing, about something her neighbor's dog had done that was both destructive and impressive. And Patrick listened without responding, which seemed to be the correct response because she didn't require one. The story moved forward on its own momentum. Emma watched Rami the way you watch weather. Not always directly, but continuously, in the peripheral vision, tracking it. There was something in it that wasn't irritation. Closer to tiredness, but the kind of tiredness that had warmth underneath it. The kind you felt for people who had been around long enough to earn it. Patrick stood. He stepped back from Carrick, and the horse moved away slowly, favoring nothing now, just walking because walking was what horses did. Patrick watched the gait, even, careful still, but even. He turned to say something about the leg, and he found Emma looking at him, not at the horse, not at Rami, at him. It lasted less than 2 seconds. She moved her eyes before he finished turning, shifted them back to Carrick with a precision that would have been convincing if he hadn't already caught it. He felt it land somewhere in his chest, that look. Not because of what it meant, he didn't know what it meant, but because of what was in it. She'd been watching him work. Really watching. The way you watched something that confused you. Something that didn't behave the way the category it belonged to was supposed to behave. He looked away, crouched back to the leg for no reason, checking something he'd already checked. Rami had moved on to a story about a goat and a gate, and a market day that had apparently ended badly for the gate. Emma made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something compressed in the middle of her chest that escaped before she could stop it. Patrick heard it. He didn't look up. He had it coming, Emma said, meaning whoever owned the gate. He absolutely had it coming, Rami agreed, with feeling. A pause. Then Rami said without any change in tone, "Patrick, do you want anything from the market Thursday? I'm going anyway." He straightened up. "No." "You sure? You look like someone who hasn't bought food in a week." "I have food." "You have whatever was already there when you stopped thinking about it." She said this without judgment, as a statement of observed fact. She looked at him with the direct, comfortable attention of someone who did not find other people's business intrusive, but rather essential. He had no answer for that. That was also not true. Emma was looking at Rami now, then, briefly, at Patrick. Something crossed her face, not sympathy, not quite, more like recognition. The kind that comes from knowing that particular shape of living. The shape of someone who has been alone long enough that the edges of it have gone smooth. She didn't say anything. She looked back at Carrick, but she didn't fold her arms again. She'd had them folded the first morning, closed, contained, a wall made of posture. Now her hands hung at her sides, 3 leather bracelets on the left wrist catching the mid-morning light. It was a small thing. It probably meant nothing. Patrick looked at it for 1 second, and then looked at the horse, and then went inside to write up the morning notes. He sat at his desk. The courtyard was visible through the window. He could hear Rami still talking, the sound of it coming through the glass, muffled and warm, and under it the occasional lower sound that was Emma. He wrote down the measurements for the leg, the reduction in swelling, the improved gait. Clinical notes, exact and dry. He did not write down any of the other things. There was no column for those. He had not looked at anyone the way he'd looked at Emma in a long time. He didn't examine why. He just set his pen down and looked at the numbers until they were only numbers. And then he picked it up again. Outside, a door opened somewhere, and light came across the courtyard at a different angle, and the wind moved through the gate and lifted a page on his desk, and he put his hand flat on it without thinking. Some things you hold down before you know you're holding them. The leg was almost clean. Patrick unwrapped the last dressing slowly, more from habit than necessity. You never rushed the final check, because the final check was where you found the thing you'd missed every other time. But there was nothing to find. The swelling had resolved to a faint thickening along the bone, the kind that would harden into scar tissue over the next few months and bother the horse not at all. The skin was cool, The hair was growing back where he'd clipped it. He sat back on his heels and looked at the leg for a moment. Then he stood. "He's close," he said. "One more day of rest. Tomorrow morning he can go home." Ima stood at Carrick's head. She'd been holding the halter loosely, one hand, the way she always did. Not gripping, just present. The horse had his eyes half closed in the early warmth. The late spring sun had come in over the steppe at a low angle and lay across the corral in a wide, flat sheet, and everything in it looked unhurried. Chica was not here this morning. "School," Amma had said when she arrived, with the tone of someone reporting a logistical fact rather than a domestic one. Patrick moved to the supply shelf along the annex wall and took down the roll of bandaging cloth. "I want to show you something," he said, "in case it happens again." Emma came to stand beside him. She was close enough that he was aware of the height difference without it being a problem. She had to angle down slightly. He had to angle up, and they met somewhere in the middle over the length of cloth in his hands. He showed her the diagonal wrap, the pressure points, where to start, how tight was tight enough. He demonstrated on his own forearm first, the way he sometimes did with clients who were nervous, so they could see the motion before they tried it. Then he handed her the cloth. She took it without hesitation and wrapped the spare piece of fence rail he used for practice. Her hands moved carefully the first time, not uncertain, just precise, reading the motion before committing to it. The second time she did it from memory, and the wrap was clean and even. "Like that?" she said. He checked the tension with his thumb. "Exactly like that." She looked at her hands, not at him, not at the rail, at her own hands, the cloth still trailing from her fingers. It was a long look for her, longer than she usually gave anything that wasn't the horse. Something in it was private. "You have good hands," Patrick said. He said it the way he said most things. Plain, because it was accurate, and there was no reason to dress it up. She didn't answer immediately. She turned her hands over, slowly, looking at the palms, then the backs. The bracelets on her left wrist shifted. There was a scar along the base of her right thumb. Old, fully healed, the kind left by a rope under tension or a tool that slipped. She looked at that, too. "Everyone says that," she said. Her voice was level, but it didn't help. He didn't ask what she meant. He'd learned, in 11 years with animals, and 2 years of a silence he'd chosen and then couldn't get out of, that asking what someone meant by a sentence like that was almost always the wrong move. The sentence wasn't an invitation. It was something that had come out because the hands were right there, and the words had been stored too long, and she probably hadn't planned to say it at all. He picked up the cloth and rolled it back neatly, pressed it even with his palms. "Carrick would have lost the leg," he said, "if it had gone another few days." He didn't look at her. "Your hands got him here." She was quiet. He set the roll back on the shelf. Outside, the wind moved through the corral, and Carrick shifted his weight, the good leg taking more, an old habit he'd probably keep regardless of whether the other one healed completely. Animals carried their past in their bodies long after the injury was gone. So did people, mostly. Emma set the practice rail back against the wall. She did it with care, the same care she gave everything. Not tenderness, not quite, but an attention that meant the thing mattered even when the thing was a spare piece of wood. She dusted her hands against her trousers. "When can he work?" she asked. Back to the horse, back to the arithmetic of her life. A week? Light work, no hard ground for 2. She nodded, calculating. "The money," she said. "There's time." "I know there's time. I'm telling you I've been putting it together." She said this the same way she said most things. Not a reassurance, a correction. She wanted him to know it was coming, not because she was afraid he'd forgotten, but because she needed him to understand she hadn't. "All right," he said. She looked at him once, straight, brief, the amber eyes finding his, and then releasing them, the way she did everything, fully and then not at all. She went back to Carrick and stood beside him with one hand on his neck, and the horse exhaled long and slow, and the sound of it moved through the corral and out into the morning. Patrick leaned against the annex wall. The step beyond the fence was very green today. The wind bent the grass and released it and bent it again, endlessly patient, going nowhere. He thought about what she'd said. The hands. Everyone says that. He thought about what it meant to be told your whole life that you had something good, and to arrive at a point where the good thing had not been enough to hold whatever you'd tried to hold with it. He knew something about that. Not the same shape, not the same wound, but the same geography of it. The way you stopped trusting the thing you were told was your strength because it hadn't saved the thing you needed it to save. He didn't say any of this. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying, and he'd learned, slowly, at some cost, that not all silences needed filling. If you've ever been told you were good at something and still felt it wasn't enough, you know what Amma was holding in that moment. If this story is finding you somewhere like that, stay with it. Subscribe if you want to know how it ends. It ends quietly. The best things do. Carrick moved to the water trough. Emma watched him go with her arms at her sides, hands open, not folded, not gripping anything, just open in the morning light, which was more than it sounded like. The rancher came on a Wednesday. Patrick heard the truck before he saw it. A diesel engine, the kind kept running past its years by someone who considered maintenance an argument they were winning. It stopped outside the gate and didn't move for a moment, which was the first thing. People who came for the animals came straight in. People who came for him stopped first. He was at the workbench in the annex, cleaning instruments, when the gate opened. He came out with the cloth still in his hand. The man was broad, mid-50s, wearing a coat that had been expensive once. He had the look of someone who owned enough land that he'd stopped having to think about weather. The tan was even, not a working tan. His name was Gersh. He ran cattle on the eastern edge of the village boundary, 200 head at least, and he'd been Patrick's largest single client for 6 years. He brought his animals in seasonally, paid on time, shook hands firmly. He had never come without calling first. "Patrick," he said. Not a greeting, a placement. "Gersh." Patrick folded the cloth over his arm. "Something wrong with the cattle?" "Not the cattle." Gersh looked around the courtyard. His eyes moved to the corral, to Carrick at the trough, to the fence where the hinge had been fixed, and the loose nails tapped back, and the rail checked for rot. He took all of it in without appearing to. "Heard you've had company." "Client's horse," Patrick said. "Periosteal bruise. Recovering well." "Orc's horse." "Horse," Patrick said. Gersh was quiet for a moment. He put his hands in his coat pockets, which was the posture of a man who had decided how a conversation was going to go before he arrived at it. He looked at Patrick with something that wasn't quite hostility, closer to the expression of someone delivering a warning they considered reasonable. "People talk," he said. "Village like this, people talk. You've got them here every morning, the kid running around. The other one, the loud one." He paused. "It looks a certain way." "It looks like a veterinary practice," Patrick said. "It looks like you're making a choice about whose side you're on." The morning was quiet around them. The wind had dropped. Somewhere past the fence, the stepgrass stood straight for once, and the light came down flat and even, and there was no sound from the corral, which meant Carrick was listening the way horses did, ears forward, still, reading the air. Patrick looked at Gersh. He felt the weight of 6 years of reliable income, of seasonal contracts, of handshakes that had meant something practical. He felt it the way you felt a stone in your hand. Real, solid, the specific gravity of it. "I heal animals," he said. "All of them." He said it the same way he said most things. No heat, no emphasis. Just the fact of it, set down where Gersh could look at it. Gersh looked at it. His jaw moved slightly, not chewing, processing. He was not a stupid man. He understood that what he'd just heard was not a negotiating position. It was a perimeter. "That's your answer," he said. "That's the answer," Patrick said. Gersh nodded once, the slow nod of a man recalculating. He didn't threaten anything. He didn't raise his voice. He put his hand back in his coat pocket and turned toward the gate and walked through it, and the diesel engine started again, and the truck moved off down the road that ran beside the step, and the sound of it faded into the wind, which had come back now, gentle, from the east. Patrick stood in the courtyard. He was aware, in the specific way you became aware of things after they'd already happened, that he should probably feel something more complicated than he did. 6 years. His largest client. The kind of money that made the difference between a slow month and a bad one. He felt it. He just didn't feel it more than the other thing. The thing that had been sitting in his chest since Gersh said, "Whose side you're on?" And which was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it. A quiet refusal, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it had already been decided before the truck pulled up. He turned back toward the annex. She was in the doorway. Emma stood in the annex doorway with one hand on the frame and her eyes on the gate where the truck had been. She hadn't made a sound. He didn't know how long she'd been there. Long enough, by the look of her. Her jaw was set, her eyes moving from the gate back to him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. It wasn't the closed expression, the arms folded one. It was something more open, which made it harder to read. She'd heard. All of it. He didn't explain himself. He picked up the cloth from where he'd set it on the fence post and went back to the annex. She stepped aside to let him through. He went back to the instruments, picked up where he'd left off. Cloth, metal, slow, even pressure. Emma didn't leave. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and he could feel her working through something, running it against everything she knew about how people behaved, checking it for the part that made sense. The part where he'd said what he'd said because he wanted something in return, or because he didn't understand the cost, or because he was performing something for an audience. There was no audience. There was just him and the instruments and the cloth. She made a sound in the back of her throat. Not a word, not quite. The sound of something that didn't have a word yet. Something her body registered before her mind had processed it. Then she walked back to the corral. He heard her footsteps cross the yard, heard the corral gate, heard Carrick shift at her approach. Patrick set down the instrument he was cleaning, looked at the wall in front of him. 6 years was a long time. 2 years was also a long time. Some things you lost slowly, and some things you lost in the time it took a truck to pull away, and neither kind left you with more than the choice you'd made. He picked up the next instrument. Outside, Ima said something to Carrick in a low voice, too low to hear, not meant for him. The horse moved. The corral gate settled on its new hinge, smooth and quiet. You could know a person for years and never see them choose anything. And sometimes you saw it happen in 30 seconds, and it told you everything the years hadn't. She came in the evening without the horse. Patrick heard the gate at a time he didn't expect anyone. The light was going amber, the step cooling fast the way it did when the sun dropped, the sky turning colors that had no names in practical language. He'd eaten nothing since morning. He knew this the way you knew things you decided not to act on, as background information, filed and ignored. He was at his desk, not working. Sitting at his desk the way he sometimes did in the evenings, the chair pulled slightly back, the papers in front of him technically requiring attention, his eyes on the middle distance, where the window showed the yard and the fence and the beginning of the step beyond. The quiet of the clinic in the evening was a specific kind of quiet. Not empty, full of what wasn't there. The footsteps crossed the yard differently than they did in the mornings, slower. Not hesitant. Amma didn't do hesitant. But measured, like someone who had made a decision and was now executing it without hurrying. He heard the knock on the door frame, not the door. The frame, knuckles on wood, matter of fact. "Come in," he said. She came in. She was wearing a different jumper, darker, no shoulder visible, the neck higher. She had a container in her hands, the kind with a clip lid, the kind used for carrying food from one place to another. She set it on the table beside his papers and stepped back. "Rami said you haven't been eating properly," she said. She looked at the container, not at him. She would have come herself, but she had the chickens. He looked at the container, then at Emma. "She asked you to bring it." A pause that answered the question without answering it. "She mentioned it," Emma said. He understood the architecture of what had just happened. Rami had mentioned it the way Rami mentioned most things, completely, at volume, probably more than once, until it became impossible to continue not doing anything about it. And Emma had done something about it, herself, in the evening, without the horse as a reason. She was already turning toward the door. "We stay," he said. The question came out the same way his questions usually came. Plain, without weight attached, just the words. He hadn't planned to ask it. It was accurate, so he said it. She stopped. Her hand was not quite at the door frame. A long pause. Not the pause of someone deciding, more the pause of someone letting themselves finish deciding something they'd already started on the walk over. "No," she said. She left. The gate closed, the good hinge doing its job, and her footsteps moved away across the dirt road and disappeared into the sound of the wind. Patrick sat for a moment. Then he got up and opened the container. Rice by the smell of it, and something with herbs. Thyme, he thought, and something else he didn't have a name for, something that belonged to whoever had cooked this rather than to any recipe he knew. There was a piece of flatbread folded on top, still carrying warmth through the container wall. He found a fork. He sat back down at his desk and ate. It was good. Not complicated. Rice, vegetables, something with a faint heat to it that built slowly and then settled. The flatbread was dense and had a slight char on one side. He ate without thinking about anything in particular, which was unusual. He generally thought about something while eating, on the rare occasions he ate at the desk. Paperwork, supply lists, the day's cases. Tonight his mind stayed level and quiet, moving with the food rather than around it. He ate everything. He set the fork down and looked at the empty container. The lid sat beside it, clipped back on reflex. Outside, the step had gone dark at the edges, and the last light was a thin line above the horizon, the color of embers. He thought about Rami saying he hadn't been eating properly, which was true, and which he had not said to anyone, which meant Rami had simply seen it the way she saw everything, directly, without being invited, and without making a problem out of it. He thought about Emma walking across the village in the evening with a container in her hands, not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was knowing she hadn't. He thought about the word no, the length of the pause before it, the way her hand had been not quite at the door frame. There was a version of no that meant Not ever. And there was a version that meant not yet. Not like this. Not when I can't see far enough ahead to trust what I'd be walking toward. He'd used both versions himself at different times. He knew the difference from the inside. He washed the fork. He rinsed the container and set it upside down on the drying cloth beside the basin so it would be clean when she came for it. He hadn't thought about whether she would come for it. He just set it out. Then he went back to his desk and picked up the papers that needed attention and worked until the last of the light was gone and the lamp was the only bright thing in the room. The food sat in him steadily, the warmth of it working outward from the center. His hands on the papers felt less mechanical than they had in the morning. He didn't think about why. Some things don't require analysis. A person brought food because another person hadn't been eating. The food was good. The night was quiet. That was enough. Sometimes enough was not a compromise. Sometimes it was the whole thing. The letter arrived on a Friday. Patrick found it under the door in the morning. Not delivered by hand, not slipped through with any particular subtlety, just there on the floor when he came through from the back. An envelope with the veterinary authorities' seal on the upper left corner. The kind of envelope that had its own gravity before you opened it. He stood in the doorway of his own clinic in his socks and held it for a moment, reading the outside first, which told him nothing except that it was official and therefore meant to feel heavy. He opened it. Inspection. 14 days. Complaints received regarding sanitary conditions and record-keeping practices. A formal list of what they would be looking at. The language was careful and procedural, and said everything with the flatness of something that had been filed, processed, and forwarded without anyone examining the original claim. He set it on the desk, stood looking at it. He knew exactly where it had come from. Not from the language or the filing date, but from the timing. A week after a diesel truck had pulled away from his gate with a man inside it who had not gotten the answer he'd come for. The complaint existed because of 30 seconds in a courtyard and 3 words spoken plainly into the morning air. He had known there might be a cost. He had not known the shape of it. He went through his records first. All of them, methodically, the way he did everything, starting from the oldest and working forward. The records were good. He kept good records because animals couldn't tell you what was wrong a second time if you forgot to write it down the first time. Supply logs, treatment notes, dates, dosages, outcomes. The sanitary conditions in the clinic were what they always were, clean, organized, the kind of order that came not from inspection anxiety, but from 11 years of working in a small space and knowing where everything was in the dark. There was nothing to find. That didn't mean the inspection wouldn't cost him 2 weeks of pressure and a formal mark on his file that would require paperwork to clear, regardless of outcome. He sat with that for a while. Then he called Rami. He hadn't planned to call Rami. He'd planned to call the authorities' office and ask procedural questions about the timeline. But the phone was in his hand, and he found himself saying her name instead, which told him something about what he actually needed, which was not procedural information. He told her flatly. The letter. The timing. The probable origin. He didn't ask for anything. He just told her because she was the kind of person who received information and knew what to do with it. And because he was tired of knowing things alone. Rami was quiet for 4 full seconds, which was long for her. "I'll call you back," she said. She called back in 20 minutes. "Don't do anything," she said. "I'm coming over." She arrived in 40 minutes with her basket and Ima behind her. Ima had not been told, apparently, until Rami appeared at her door. He could see it in the way she came through the gate. Not the measured morning pace, something faster, something that had been accelerated by information received in motion. She looked at him first, then at the clinic, then at him again. "Show me," she said. He showed her the letter. She read it standing up, holding it with both hands, her eyes moving through it quickly, and then going back to the top and moving through it again. Her face gave nothing away while she read. When she finished, she set it down on the desk with a precision that was controlled rather than calm. "Gersh," she said. "Probably," he said. "Not probably." He didn't argue. Rami had set her basket down and was already at the window looking out at the road, as if the village were a system she was reading, which, in some sense, it was. She knew everyone. She knew their grievances and their histories and the specific ways they were likely to behave when something moved against them. She had been here longer than either of them, and she held that knowledge the way she held everything, lightly, readily, available to use. "Maran will sign," Rami said, not turning from the window. "And old Devitt. Possibly the Hakon family, if I explain it right." She turned. "You've treated their dogs, both of them, and the goat." "I treated the goat," Patrick said. "The goat was their daughter's. It counts more." She was already pulling her phone from her pocket. What happened over the next 6 hours was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. Rami made calls, short, direct calls, her voice moving from warm to businesslike and back again, depending on who was on the other end. Emma sat at Patrick's table and wrote, in a careful hand, a factual account of Carrick's treatment. Dates, procedures, outcomes, the condition of the clinic on each visit. Not testimony, documentation. She did it without being asked, without discussing it with him first, simply because she had identified what was needed and her hands were good for it. Patrick checked the supply room again. Reorganized nothing because nothing needed reorganizing, but checked it because having something to do with his hands made the waiting bearable. By evening, there were 5 people at his door. Not a crowd, 5 people, standing in the courtyard in the cooling, late spring air, each with a written statement. Marin, who was 70 and had been bringing her cats to Patrick for 9 years. Old Devitt, who kept his statement brief and signed it with the emphasis of a man who had dealt with enough bureaucracy to know exactly what was needed. The Hakon couple, who had brought their daughter's statement as well, written in a child's handwriting on paper with a small flower in the corner, which Patrick looked at for a moment before placing in the file. And Rami herself, with her own account of Carrick's case and a separate note about the general conduct and quality of the clinic that she'd apparently written in the afternoon. 5 statements. 5 signatures. A stack of paper that amounted to a specific kind of answer to a specific kind of question. Patrick stood at the door of his clinic and looked at the 5 of them in his courtyard and felt something move in his chest that he didn't examine too closely, because examining it would have made the evening longer than it needed to be. Emma was at the back of the small group. She'd handed him her documentation an hour ago without comment. Now she stood with her arms at her sides, not folded, watching him take the last statement from Marin and add it to the file. He looked at the stack of paper, then at the courtyard full of people who had come without being asked to do more than sign. "Thank you," he said. To the group, and to no particular person, which was the only way he could say it without his voice doing something he hadn't authorized. Marin waved her hand dismissively, the gesture of someone who had decided long ago that thanks were less useful than action. David nodded. The Hakons spoke briefly to Rami about something involving the Thursday market, and then, one by one, they went home, back through the gate into the evening, until only Rami and Emma were left. Rami squeezed his arm once, a brief, firm contact, the kind that meant, "I see this, and it matters." And then she too went through the gate, calling something back over her shoulder about the chickens needing feeding. Emma looked at the file in his hand, then at him. She said nothing. She turned and walked toward the gate, her footsteps even on the courtyard dirt, and the good hinge held the gate open a moment after she was through it, and the step beyond was dark, and the stars had come out over the grassland. the kind of stars that appeared when the village lights were insufficient to push them back. He stood in his own doorway with a file full of other people's handwriting. He'd been alone in this clinic for 2 years. He'd told himself the quiet was what he needed. Told himself the animals were sufficient company, and the work was sufficient purpose, and the silence he'd chosen was something other than loneliness, because he'd chosen it. The file was heavy, not from the paper. Some walls come down slowly, in small pieces, over days, and some come down on a Tuesday evening, when 5 people stand in your courtyard with their names written on paper, and you understand, without wanting to, that you have not been as alone as you thought. Carec walked out of the corral on his own. Patrick opened the gate and stepped back, and the horse came through without prompting, head low, reading the ground with his nose the way horses did when they were reacquainting themselves with the world outside a fence. He walked the length of the yard twice. Even gait, no hesitation, the left leg taking weight the same as the right. He stopped at the far fence and looked out at the step, ears forward, reading something in the air that only he could read. Patrick watched the gate. Then he watched the horse stand, which told you as much as the movement if you knew what to look for. The weight distribution, the set of the neck, the way the ears tracked without the head compensating for discomfort. Everything said the same thing. The leg was done. Clean. Emma was at the gate. She'd come at the usual time, before the heat, and she'd stood at the corral fence, watching the walkout without speaking. Her hands were on the top rail. She watched Carec reach the far fence and look at the step, and she watched him for a long time. "He's good," Patrick said. She nodded. She knew. She'd known before he said it, probably before Carec had taken 3 steps. Because she knew this horse the way you knew something you'd built your daily life around. In the body, before the brain had finished processing. She came into the yard and walked to the horse, put her hand on his neck. Carec turned his head and pressed his nose briefly against her shoulder, and then looked back at the step, because he was a horse and his attention was already elsewhere. She kept her hand on his neck for a moment. Then she stepped back and took the lead rope from her belt and clipped it to the halter, ready to go home. Patrick went inside. He came back with the invoice, a single sheet, the numbers written out in his hand the way he wrote everything. He handed it to her. She read it. She read it the way she read everything, fully, from the top, twice. Then she looked up at him. "This is not the full price," she said. "It's the price." "I know the full price." I asked Marin what she paid for the Dobrev horse last autumn. Same injury, fewer days. She held the paper level, not accusatory, just presenting the discrepancy as a fact that required addressing. "This is less than half." "Full price is when the customer can pay," he said. She looked at him. The amber eyes steady, reading him the same way she'd read the paper, fully, looking for the thing underneath. He let her look. There was nothing underneath. It was the same principle that had operated since the first morning, when he'd said, "later," and meant it. The price was what it was because she was who she was, and the situation was what it was, and he didn't know how to run a clinic on any other terms without becoming someone he didn't want to be. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. An envelope, folded once. She'd prepared it before she came. He could tell by the fold, the way it had been creased with intention rather than hurry. She counted out the bills onto the desk beside the invoice, the amount on the paper, exact. Then she stopped. She held the remaining bills in her hand. She had them folded together, the amount she'd calculated for the full price, minus what he was asking for. She stood there with that money in her hand and looked at it. And he didn't speak. And the clinic was quiet around them, the morning sounds of the step coming through the window, grass, wind, a bird somewhere out beyond the fence. The money stayed in her hand for a long time. He had the sense she was running something through, not an argument, not a calculation, something older than both of those. The way her people measured debt, perhaps. The way you handled being given something you hadn't asked for and couldn't easily balance. In her world, from what he'd understood across the past days without being told directly, kindness arrived with conditions attached. Not always visible conditions, not always immediate, but there. The expectation of eventual return, of eventual leverage. You learned to account for it because not accounting for it had costs. He'd given her no conditions. He'd had no leverage to apply. He'd simply said the price was the price and left her standing in it. Her hand closed around the remaining bills. Then she put them back in the envelope, put the envelope back in her pocket. The motion was deliberate. Not defeated. Decided. The difference was important, and he felt it in the air between them. She picked up the paid amount from the desk and held it out to him. He took it. "The inspection," she said. 2 weeks. "Rami says the statements are enough." "Probably," he said. "The records are clean." She nodded. She looked at the desk, the filed papers stacked to one side, the record books aligned at the edge. Everything in its place, everything documented. The evidence of a practice run on terms that were their own and nobody else's. "If they come," she said, "I'll be here." He looked at her. She wasn't offering it as a gesture. She was reporting a fact about what would happen, the same way she reported most facts, because it was true, and it needed saying, and that was sufficient reason. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She picked up Carrick's lead rope. "I said I'll be here." He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with when someone stated a thing that plainly. She led the horse toward the gate. Carrick went willingly, already leaning toward home, his body orienting to the familiar smell of the stable, the other horses, the steppe grass he'd been looking at for 6 days from the wrong side of a fence. Patrick walked with them to the gate and opened it. Emma led the horse through. She didn't stop, didn't turn, but she slowed, almost imperceptibly, for 2 steps after the gate. A pause so small it might have been nothing, the horse adjusting to the road surface, the morning light changing at the edge of the yard. He closed the gate. He stood at his fence and watched them go down the road. Ima's pace, the horse walking beside her, the steppe wide and pale green beyond the village edge, the sky above it the blue of deep water. She didn't look back. She had the lead rope loose in her hand and her head up, and the long pigtails moving in the early wind. The money was in his hand. He hadn't counted it. He put it in his pocket. He went back inside. The clinic was quiet in the particular way it was quiet after an animal left, the absence of a specific presence rather than just absence in general. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, aware of it. He had worked for 11 years in this clinic. He had treated what came through the gate. He had asked no questions that weren't necessary and offered nothing that wasn't requested, and kept the silence he'd chosen with the discipline of someone who had decided that needing less was safer than needing more. He stood in the middle of his clinic and understood, without drama, without looking at it too hard, that the last 6 days had made a small, permanent change to the shape of things. Not large, not the kind that announced itself, the kind you found later, when you reached for something you'd always kept in one place, and discovered, without surprise, that you'd moved it somewhere better. He put the kettle on. 2 cups were on the shelf. He took one down, then he took the other one down and set it on the counter beside the first. He didn't fill it. He just set it there. The water came to a boil, and he made his tea and left the second cup where it was. And the morning moved on around the clinic the way it always did, unhurried and indifferent to small decisions made in small rooms. But the cup was there. That was different from before. Chica came running. Patrick heard her before he saw her. The slap of rubber boots on the dirt road, uneven and fast, the sound of someone who had decided to run and committed to it completely. The gate banged open in the old way, the first morning way, and she was across the yard in seconds and up to the clinic door with both hands on the frame, slightly out of breath, looking up at him with her amber eyes and the absolute composure of someone executing a plan they considered airtight. "Mom sent me," she said. He looked at her. She had something on her chin, clay possibly, or something from the stable. Her overalls had a new patch on the left knee that hadn't been there before, dark blue against the lighter denim, stitched in a straight line. She'd lost one hair elastic somewhere between home and here, because her ponytail was lower on one side, listing slightly. "All right," he said. "She said to ask about the medicine. For horses. In case the leg does the thing again." She delivered this with the confidence of someone reciting something memorized, which it clearly was, and which was clearly not the whole truth, and which both of them understood without discussing it. He considered her for a moment. She looked back at him with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to look away from things. He went to the supply shelf. He took down a small cloth packet, dried herbs, the kind he used in the poultice, the kind that reduced inflammation in soft tissue and cost him nothing to give away because he grew most of them in the strip of garden behind the annex. He tied it with a short length of twine. He came back and held it out to her. "Tell your mom it's just like that," he said. She took the packet and looked at it seriously, turning it over in her small hands, pressing it slightly to see if it was firm. She smelled it once, the way she investigated everything, thoroughly, without self-consciousness. "What does it smell like?" she asked. "Time, mostly." "And yarrow?" "Is yarrow good?" "For this, yes." She nodded, satisfied. She tucked the packet into the front pocket of her overalls and patted it flat. She looked around the clinic the way she always did. The instruments on the shelf, the record books, the basin, the 2 cups on the counter that she looked at for a moment without commenting on. Then she looked back at him. "Are you going to come see the horses sometime?" she said. "Our ones. Emma says you could, if there was a reason." He thought about that, about the precision of it, if there was a reason. The door opened to the width of a reason and no wider, which was exactly the width that could be opened right now, and was therefore, from Emma, a generous measurement. "If there's a reason," he said. Chica accepted this. She dropped off the doorstep and crossed the yard at the same speed she'd arrived, boots loud on the dirt, ponytail swinging unevenly, her hand pressed flat over the pocket with the herbs. She went through the gate without looking back. Down the road she ran, toward the stable at the edge of the village, toward the horses and the steppe beyond. Patrick stood in his doorway. The morning was still. The wind had not come up yet. It came later now, the late spring tipping toward summer, the air holding its warmth longer before the steppe pulled it away. The sky was pale blue above the grass line, deepening as it went up, the kind of blue that had no bottom to it. He watched Chica go until she turned the bend in the road and was gone. Then he looked toward the stable. He couldn't see it from here, but he knew its direction. He knew the direction of most things in a village this size, the way you knew without thinking about it, the geography of a place settling into the body over years until it became its own kind of knowledge. The stable was northeast, past the Hakon place, at the edge of the last row of buildings before the steppe began. He didn't move toward it. He stood in his doorway and looked at the road. Emma was at the stable door. She'd seen Chica leave. She stood in the open doorway of the low building, one hand on the frame, the same posture he'd had 30 seconds ago, which he didn't know and she didn't know, and which wouldn't have meant anything if either of them had known, except that it did, quietly, in the way that most things that mattered were quiet. She watched Chica come back, watched her daughter cross the yard at speed and hold up the packet, both hands, the way you held up evidence. Ima took it. She looked at it. She turned it in her hands the way Chica had turned it, pressing it once, feeling the herbs shift inside the cloth. She looked toward the clinic. Patrick's door was visible from here. A rectangle of darker stone, the lean of the annex beside it, the corral fence that Chica had once draped her wrapped arm over to show a horse. The gate stood open. The courtyard was empty in the morning light. She looked at it for a moment. The packet warm in her hand, the herbs inside it something she hadn't asked for, something given because it could be given, because that was apparently how he operated, without conditions and without keeping count. She turned around. She walked back into the stable. Her horses shifted at her entrance, the two remaining ones moving to orient toward her, ears tracking, the low, warm sound of animals that knew their person. She went to the first one, a gray, older, with a white stripe down its nose, and ran her hand along its neck the way she always did, reading it. She walked slower than usual. Not much. A degree or two of pace, the same degree or two by which she'd slowed at his gate the morning she left with Carrick. The same imperceptible adjustment that meant nothing and meant everything, depending on whether you were paying attention. The step was behind the stable. Through the back wall's single window she could see the grass running flat to the horizon, green and moving, the wind finally starting now, coming from the east the way it came most mornings. Ahead of her, past the stable door she'd left open, the road ran back through the village and ended, eventually, at a stone clinic with a gate whose hinge no longer dragged. She held the packet. She put it in her pocket. She stayed with her horses. Outside, the steppe moved in the wind the way it always moved, without urgency, without destination, patient in the way that only very large things could afford to be. The village went about its morning. Somewhere a gate opened. Somewhere a child's voice carried across the rooftops and dissolved into the open air. And in a stone clinic on the other side of the road, a man stood in his doorway for a moment longer than necessary before going back to his work. And 2 cups sat on the counter, and the morning held everything in it without asking any of it to be more than it was. Some distances close slowly. Not all the way, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but a fraction, a step. The length of a little girl running down a road with herbs in her pocket, and a lie that wasn't really a lie, because the truth inside it was true enough. That's how it starts, when it starts. Not with a declaration, not with a decision you can point to, just with someone walking a little slower than they did the day before, and the space between 2 people being, by some small measure, less than it was. If this story found you somewhere quiet, subscribe so the next one can find you too. These are the kinds of stories that are easy to miss when the world is loud. Leave a like if Ima's pace felt familiar. You know what I mean. The step doesn't rush. Neither does trust, but it moves.